Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Corombos of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. 3 martinis coming up.
Glad you made it through the weekend and glad you're with us today for the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Jim is still away. He'll be back later this week. Here once again, Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He is a National Review Online contributing editor and columnist, and he's also a Fox News contributor. And we're actually going to start with Andy's latest piece. It deals with Jack Smith, which, if you watch the media coverage of Jack Smith, it's like they've kind of peeled the Bob Mueller and Anthony Fauci stickers off their votive and prayer candles, and now Jack Smith is their great hope to get the legal decision that they want here. But your piece deals with the fact, Andy, that he might not have the job constitutionally. It could be improperly done. You point to the clause of the Constitution, which deals with such things, and it says, shall nominate, that means the president, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors and other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by the law. And so your point is that either he's got to be appointed by the president or through the application of an existing statute. And you say it doesn't look like either of those are in play here. So explain why.
Yeah, Greg, I hate it when that you're trying to have a good time and then somebody pulls out the Constitution. I mean, what kind of fun is that? So look, I think that this is a serious motion. That is the motion that Trump has brought, and it's been actually backed by some pretty powerful, influential, and very deep legal scholarship. People like former attorneys general Ed Meese and Mike Mukasey, Josh Blackman, lots of serious constitutional scholars. So this is not by any means something to be dismissed or sloughed off, which a lot of people I've noticed, I've been asked about this a number of times in the last couple of days, because it's a motion that's now being argued in Florida before Judge Eileen Cannon. And of course, the Democrat media complex narrative about Judge Cannon is she was appointed by Trump, therefore she's in the tank for him, and any ruling that she makes against Smith obviously has to be corrupt. So this has been, therefore, I think, portrayed in the media as if it's a frivolous motion that she's giving the time of day because she loves Trump and hates Smith. And it's far from the case. This is a very difficult issue for the government, I think, for both legal reasons and practical reasons or political reasons. As far as the legal reasons go, as you just pointed out, the Appointments Clause basically says that if you are going to wield the powers of an officer of the United States, which means significant constitutional authority, and there's no doubt that prosecuting crime and being responsible for the prosecution of federal crime is an exercise of significant constitutional power, as Justice Scalia said famously in Morrison versus Olson back in a famous dissent he did in 1988. Prosecution's the quintessential executive power. It's the enforcement of the laws, which is a large part of why we have an executive branch in the first place. So if you're going to wield that kind of power under the Constitution, if you're in a position that the Constitution establishes or makes necessary, then you are essentially in the category of what they call a principal officer of the United States. For example, the Attorney General is a principal officer of the United States. Those offices have to be, by constitutional law, subject to nomination by the president and confirmation by the Senate before the person can take office. Then in the last part of the Appointments Clause that you just read, it talks about positions that are established by Congress, meaning they have to be established by law. Jack Smith's problem is his special counsel position is established by a Justice Department regulation. It's not established by a statute. And if Congress establishes a position by statute, ordinarily that's likely to be an inferior officer position. There's an argument, it hasn't been settled, whether, for example, district United States attorneys are principal officers or inferior officers. Some say they're principal officers because of the significant power that they exercise, in conjunction with the fact that they are nominated by the president and can only be removed by the president. The attorney general, for example, can't fire a U.S. attorney. On the other hand, U.S. attorneys are in a chain of command. They answer to the attorney general. The attorney general can assign them to cases or remove them from cases. So there's an argument that you can have, which would be a very good argument, whether they're principal or inferior. But one thing that's not in question is they are officers of the United States, which means whether you think that they have constitutional status that requires appointment by the president and confirmation by the Senate, or their positions were established by a statute that calls for them to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, regardless of which way, they're still officers. And the problem with Smith's appointment is Merrick Garland, the attorney general, in appointing him, vested in him the same authorities that are given to a district United States attorney. But he is not subject to the confirmation process of a district United States attorney, and his position was not established by a statute. So that's the legal problem they have. The political problem, I think, is more interesting, which is there was never any good reason for Merrick Garland to appoint a special counsel to investigate Trump in the first place. In fact, the Justice Department was investigating Trump for 2 years before the appointment of Smith, in both the Mar-a-Lago documents case and the January 6th case, right? So the only time you're supposed to have a special counsel under the regulations, which Garland, by the way, picks and chooses when he's going to follow and which ones he's going to follow. But what the regs say is you get a special counsel when there's a conflict of interest that is so profound the Justice Department can't ethically prosecute the case. And the classic situation is when the president's Justice Department is called on to investigate the president or the president's family, like Hunter. Interestingly, it took forever for Garland to appoint a special counsel for Hunter Biden, who is the classic case of when you have a special counsel. But he wouldn't appoint one there. He appointed one for Trump. There's no conflict of interest between the Biden Justice Department and Trump. It's a commonplace for Justice Departments to investigate political figures of both parties, but particularly the opposition party. That doesn't create a conflict. We don't worry the Biden Justice Department is going to cut Trump some slack, right, because of an improper relationship. It's quite the opposite. So there was no reason politically to appoint a special counsel for Trump. Why did Garland do it? Because Garland knew that the Biden Justice Department was going to indict Trump. And he knew that once they indicted Trump, Trump was going to say, as a political argument in the 2024 election, that Biden had weaponized the Justice Department against his political enemy. So what Garland did was a political calculation. Let me bring in this guy from outside the government, and then we can pretend that we have nothing at all to do with the Trump prosecutions. It's all this guy who's acting independently and who I've given complete discretion to do whatever the hell he wants to do, right? It was always a fiction because presidents can't get away from the fact that all the executive power in the government is reposed in the president, including especially the prosecutorial power. You can't prosecute in the United States federally unless you're using the president's power. So it was never true that Jack Smith was an independent actor who wasn't under the Justice Department chain of command and whose authority didn't come from the president. This was all done for political bunting. There was no legal reason to do this. But now he's created a problem for himself because what Jack Smith is now saying in his defense in Florida is, no. I'm an inferior officer of the United States, and it's okay for me to wield this power because I wield it under the close supervision of the Attorney General. that would be the same attorney general who's been telling us for 2 years that he doesn't control this guy and doesn't supervise his work. So they have a legal dilemma and they have a political dilemma. And before all the the Trumpy fans go up in a balloon over this, I would just point out, I don't think this is going to get the case dismissed. If the judge grants Trump's motion, it'll end up being more politically embarrassing, I think, for the Justice Department than legally consequential. Because what I think Garland could do is just assign the case to a U.S. attorney who's been confirmed by the Senate and give that U.S. attorney, I'm sure Cannon would do this, or Judge Chutkan if it happens in front of her in Washington. I'm sure they would give the U.S. attorney like a few weeks to get up to speed on the case, and then they could just proceed. The Trump people are hoping that the court's going to make a finding that everything he's done up till now, that is Smith, is invalid, and we can just throw the indictments out. I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that to happen, but I do think it would be refreshing if we punctured this ridiculous fiction that Biden is not involved in the prosecutions of his political opponent, including a prosecution for the same crimes that the same Biden Justice Department gave Biden a pass on.
Yeah. And we don't have time to get into it, but I do appreciate you bringing up the point about the left's nonstop attack against Judge Cannon, especially in contrast to, how dare you criticize Judge Engoron or Judge Merchan? This is an attack on our judicial system. It's the very foundations of our society. But when a judge actually issues some decisions that you don't agree with, then it's fair game.
If you think Engoron and Merchan are sainted, wait till you see what happens with Judge Chutkan, who is going to have come down from Mount Sinai by the time we're done with all this. I'm sorry about the religious. Maybe she was raised up by Gaia. But, one way or the other, Judge Chutkan's going to be the bee's knees, man, by the time this is all over.
All right, on to our bad martini now. And this is double-fisted, triple-fisted. It's just bad. It's really bad. But it's part of a continuing pattern. We certainly saw it at Columbia University, many campuses around the country. We see it at major demonstrations, including Washington, D.C. just a couple of weeks ago, where park officials were pelted with debris and statues were defaced. But, of course, no arrests in Washington, D.C. for that. Why would we do that when that's the people who are doing it? In L.A., protesters shouting for an intifada and getting into scuffles outside of a synagogue in Los Angeles. Here's some of the unhinged screaming through the bullhorn that we heard over the weekend. Okay, that's plenty of that. And but at the same time, and Andy, you say these stories are connected. We've got at least nearly 70 members of Congress who want to make it easier to bring Palestinians into the United States. And we're also seeing from The Guardian that Afghanistan, and meaning the Taliban, there's going to be this UN conference on Afghanistan, and they don't want women to be anywhere near this. And it appears, according to some, that the UN's probably going to give in to those demands so they can actually have the conference. That might not be completely squared away yet, but you say there's a lot of parallels here. So from L.A. to D.C. And certain people willing to bring in Palestinian refugees to this country. I'm sure not vetted all that carefully if our process is any indication so far. And then, of course, what we're seeing with the Taliban.
Well, it's obvious, Greg, that Sharia, at least the fundamentalist interpretation of it, is the string that ties all these things together. And there's been willful blindness about this for decades. And there's been, especially on the transnational progressive, I don't want to call it the transnational progressive left, because there are a lot of transnational progressives who are sort of right of center people as well. But, this whole idea that we could mesh Sharia principles with Western style democracy and that was all going to work out well, never made any sense to anybody who had actually studied this. And I have to say, the one advantage I thought I had in all of this was I was in this 8 years before 9/11 happened, prosecuting terrorists in the 90s. And I wanted to believe when we started what everybody in America seem to believe, and what anybody with a reasonably good education in America thought, which was that, what was going on in the attacks that we were facing in the early 90s was basically a couple of dozen knuckleheads in Jersey City. And if you could, wrap your arms around that, the problem would go away. But as a prosecutor who had to explain to a jury, this is why this happened, I had to get steeped in it. And what you ended up finding is that there is an interpretation of Sharia, which is not only, it's not really accurate even to call it just Islamic law, because it's really a framework for how life is to be lived and how a society is to be shaped, which of course has an important legal component, but it's really a set of mores more than just law. And it's virulently anti-Western. It's discriminatory. It's anti-Semitic. And now I always have to be clear about this. I am not saying this is the only way to interpret Sharia, and I'm not saying this is the way that most Muslims in the West interpret Sharia. But it is, to the extent that people say that this is a fringe ideology, they're the fringe, or at least they're smoking something, because this is an ideology that, whether we like it or not, is backed by 14 centuries of scholarship and is highly, highly influential in most, especially Sunni Islamic territories in the world. So the idea that you could, for example, have the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the most successful mass movement in modern history, I believe, that you could have factions of the Muslim Brotherhood get a toehold in the West, and in particular on campus. And I would point out that almost every big Islamic movement, not just in the United States, but even in Islamic countries, particularly in Egypt, the Islamic movements that destabilize societies, most of them start on campus. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad, for example, and the Islamic group, Jamaat al-Islamiyah, which was the group that was run by the guy I prosecuted, the Blind Sheikh, back in the 90s, those were campus movements. I mean, campus is always a hotbed of radicalism in fundamentalist societies. It's just a fact. And starting in the 1960s, they got a toehold in American campuses with the Muslim Students Associations. And these spread over 3 generations to the point where there are now 3 and 4 and 5 of them on many campuses throughout the United States and Canada, and throughout the West. The Muslim Students Associations was such a successful movement in the United States that it spawned what started out as a kind of a graduate program, which became the Islamic Society of North America. It's the biggest, most important, most consequential Islamist organization in the United States. It started out as basically the graduate program of the Muslim Students Associations, to the point where they almost consider it to be one big organization. Their program on campus is counter-constitutional. It's anti-Semitic. It's not just anti-Zionist, it's anti-Semitic. For the people who keep saying that this is just about politics and who's going to self-determine, who lives and under what conditions in the Middle East and in Israel, read the Hamas charter. Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the charter is a jihadist charter that basically says there is an Islamic obligation to kill Jews. And that at the end of times, even the rocks and the trees are going to find the Jews as they hide from the Muslims, and then the Muslims will be able to kill them in the final war. This is not a little political dispute. This is a tenet of a belief system that is a dominant belief system in much of the world, sadly. And we've let a lot of it into the West because we have progressives who think that you can't vet people for ideological anti-Americanism and anti-constitutionalism before they come here. Every time I say, look, I'm not talking about harassing Muslims who just want to live in the West, And I'm the first person to say, if it hadn't been for patriotic American Muslims, we wouldn't have been able to do the terrorism cases that we did. That's how we infiltrated these organizations. That's how we translated our tapes and whipped the case into something that could be persuasive to a jury. So that's not where I'm coming from. But what I'm saying is there is a political Islam that is counter-constitutional, and we need to vet for it. And every time you make an argument like that, they say, oh, it's the Red Scare all over again. But you see the results of this. So the stories that you just outlined, the anti-Semitism and these riots that we saw in Los Angeles over the weekend, this is a Sharia-driven, religious-driven anti-Semitism. And that's what it is. It's not just like, it's not like, some political flavor of the day. This is an ancient hatred. When the Taliban comes and they say that like some UN committee shouldn't have women on it, that's because that's what Sharia says. Yusuf Qaradawi, who was like the most influential Sharia jurisprudent in the Muslim Brotherhood in modern times, he said something that they found to be very controversial. Now, mind you, this guy is a Sharia fundamentalist who thinks that, or who thought, he passed away a few years ago, but who thought that, like, for example, if a woman gets raped, but she's adopted Western mores and is wearing Western dress, it's her fault. She's asking for it, right? And he is the one who also blessed and gave the green light to even women participating in suicide bombings in Israel against Jews because it was for killing Jews, which is what this is all about, a lot of it. He controversially said that he thought it was okay for women to serve in government in Islamic societies. And when you asked him to explain why, what he said was, well, because it really doesn't matter who serves because we're bound by Sharia. God laid down what we're allowed to do, so everybody knows what it is, and it doesn't matter if you want to fill the seats with women or you want to fill the seats with men. What difference does it make? Because we're bound to impose Sharia and apply Sharia. That was controversial for him to say that, and he got a lot of criticism from Islamic groups for saying that. But that's a progressive in this ideology, right?
Yeah. We'll let the women impose Sharia. That's our progressive vision.
Right. So the Taliban are like literalist great minds of the 7th century. I mean, that's just who they are. They're not as hip and progressive as Sheikh Qaradawi, between fatwas for suicide bombings. But that's what we're dealing with. And the problem here, Greg, in a nutshell, is we've let all these people into the country. And we turn the campus into a catalyst for this ideology. And if you let that go on for 3 generations, then you wake up one day and you have what we have today. And everybody says, gee, how did this happen? And I'm like, it's been happening for 60 years.
Yeah. Now that's part of the old left approach. When you don't have the numbers, tolerance. But then the second they are the ones in control, the tolerance evaporates. It is not a two-way street with them. And we're seeing it on this issue, among many others. All right, Andy, in our last few minutes here, taking a look at Donald Trump and some trouble he got into with his own base, and for good reason, recently. He was on a podcast, and the issue was about keeping the best and brightest in this country if they've happened to come here to study. And that might be a little bit of a deeper conversation, but that's not what Trump ended up proposing in this conversation. He said that in order to make sure that the best and the brightest and good business ideas stay in this country, that if you graduate from any college in this country and as a foreign student, you should be given green card. So here's what he said.
What I want to do and what I will do is you graduate from a college, I think you should get automatically as part of your diploma a green card to be able to stay in this country. And that includes junior colleges too. Anybody graduates from a college, you go in there for 2 years or 4 years. If you graduate or you get a doctorate degree from a college, you should be able to stay in this country. And you know more stories than I do, but I know of stories where people graduated from a top college or from a college and they desperately wanted to stay here. They had a plan for a company, a concept, and they can't. They go back to India, they go back to China, they do the same basic company in those places, and they become multi-billionaires employing thousands and thousands of people, and it could have been done here.
So, Andy, there's been a long policy, I think, in U.S. immigration law that if you provide some sort of special ability, some sort of special skill, they evaluate you on a case-by-case basis, and you might get bumped a little bit towards the front of the line. But this idea that anybody who comes from another country and graduates and gets a green card, I mean, that forget about vetting people at the border. You're just waving them in. You could have radicals from all over the place as long as they keep their records fairly clean. If they even vet that, coming in here and burrowing and creating roots, that could be just as big, if not a bigger problem.
Yeah, I got my degree in oppressive societies, and I wrote my thesis on why the United States Constitution sucks. Why don't you wave me in, right? Has Trump been watching what's been going on these campuses for the last, when's October 7th? It's been
more than 8 months. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, hello. So, as you said, there's a deeper conversation to be had here. And I get this 2016 feeling all over again, Greg, where someone's going to say, you can't take Trump literally. You have to take him however you're supposed to take him. Right. Well, it's hard to take that one seriously, right? But I mean, there is a deeper conversation to be had about the desirability, which I think is highly desirable, of changing the immigration system so that it's weighted in favor of people who would bring a contribution to American society rather than in favor of family unification, where basically it's like, you get here for some reason, and then like your third uncle can get here, and then his cousin, and then that's an insane way to run an immigration system. But we should be having a conversation about how do we best match the needs of American society, and in particular the needs of the American economy, although I don't think it should just be the economy. Right. But how do we have an immigration system that feeds those needs? On the other hand, as we just said in the last segment, and I have to say these martinis, Greg, are driving me to drink, thank God. But like the guy that I prosecuted in the 90s, we wanted to kick him out of the country. You know what the INS found out? They found out that we couldn't kick him out because he had gotten a green card as a religious laborer. Look for a plan to blow up the American military. So that was like the religious sermons that we were getting at his mosque there. But he was in the country with a green card as a religious laborer. So, obviously we need to more carefully vet people, and we should have an immigration system that matches our needs to the people who want to come here. But frankly, if I'm Trump, I think I said to you when we were joshing a little bit before we started, the topic for this one should be, does anyone want to win this election? Because I think the mood of most people in the country is, I don't want to talk about how we bring more people into the country at this point. I want to talk about how are we going to shore up the border first, and how are we going to get the people who don't have a right to be here out of here. And once you get that under control, then come back to me and we'll talk about like who else we should bring into the country. And in the meantime, we'll just seem to have to struggle with the 330 million people we already have here to fill our needs. But otherwise, get the damn border under control. I mean, I think that's what most people want. And up until this last story, I thought that was what Trump wanted too.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. That was the issue that he's dominating. It's one of the biggest issues in the campaign, and all he's done is muddy the waters here. And his campaign is now walking that back and saying, "Oh, well, there'll be a thorough vetting process," and on and on and on. But it's hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube.
Right. Seriously, not literally. Come on, guys. Come on.
All right, Andy. The 3 virtual martinis are done. I'll let you get to the real ones.
I may need to. It's going to be early. What did Rodney Dangerfield used to say? I'll be drinking early today. It's going to be one of those days.
We appreciate it. Sorry for the elevated blood pressure. We'll try to do better tomorrow. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Greg.
Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. In for Jim Garrity, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for listening today, and thanks for subscribing. If you don't, please subscribe and tell your friends to do it. Thanks for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch Podcast. Follow us all on X. Andy is at Andrew C. McCarthy. Jim is at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great Monday. Join us again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.